Hey friends, welcome back to Make Anything. I'm Devin, and today we've got another giant number from this huge numbers project I've been working on. Today we've got this nice number 3 with a really cool layered effect going on, and this is what's known as a 2.5D effect, because while this object is 3D, the effect makes it look even more 3D. It looks like the inside of this 3 is kind of sinking back into the number, when in reality, this thing is no more than 2 inches thick. So I think it came out really well. It's a cool effect and I'm really happy with how it turned out. So today I'm going to show you the whole process of how I made this, and I hope you'll enjoy. Let's get to it. Cool. Now before I actually started this new CNC project, I first wanted to upgrade my vacuum system that I designed for the CNC, since clearly it was still leaving quite a bit of sawdust behind. On top of switching to a 2-inch diameter hose, double what the original was, I redesigned the entire vacuum system, and this time around I actually 3D printed the bristles for the brush that helps maintain suction on that vacuum system. This was printed with Filementum's FlexFill TPU. It's a flexible filament, and all I had to do was cut off one end, leaving loose bristles behind. And I actually nailed it pretty well on my first try, with these bristles coming out really nicely. The 98A Shore hardness of this flexible filament is perfect. And by printing the bristles out, I was able to design this kind of system where they just slide into this ring. So there's this small opening, and you just start sliding the bristles in through there and feeding them all the way around the circle until it creates this closed brush. Just slide that over a bit more and the brush is pretty much locked in. The hard orange part here is printed using MatterHacker's Pro PLA, as well as the rest of this vacuum system. This time around I also designed it to have a magnetic connection, and by alternating the magnets north, south, I was able to design this in a way that it snaps right into place. Although I did get the magnets backwards this time around, and that's why suddenly I have a pink connector instead of orange. So I went ahead and fixed that, and I was left with this really nice snapping mechanism. So here I am installing the rest of the system. It's very similar to the last one, although it's got that upgraded 2-inch diameter hose, and it looks really nice. So with that problem hopefully fixed, I got into Fusion 360 to start designing this number 3. And the design is actually really simple. All I did was take this sketch of the number 3 and I shifted it down to the right several times for each new layer in order to create this 2.5D effect that I was talking about earlier. And as you can kind of see here, every layer includes all of the extrusions from the layer above it. And when you look at the individual profiles here, they do make some weird shapes, but all together, it makes a very awesome cohesive design. So from there, I went ahead and started planning out my cuts in the manufacture workspace. And this time around, I decided to hold the piece in place using tabs. So you can see those on the outer contour here, those little blue tabs. And that's gonna hold my piece in place while it cuts the entire outline. So I don't have to use any double stick tape or super glue to hold this down. I'll just put screws in each corner of the stock, and then I can go ahead and count on those tabs to hold everything down while the part is completed. So of course I needed several pieces of plywood to make all these different layers of the number 3. So I just cut down all this plywood at once, creating a whole bunch of pieces that are 24 by 36 inches, which fit perfectly on the bed of my CNC. Then, as I said, I can just screw down each of the corners and then go ahead and start my cut. On this first one, I wasn't using the full vacuum brush attachment just yet, because I just wanted to see how it worked without that attachment. And as you can see, it is definitely sucking up some of that sawdust, but it also still leaves plenty behind. Another problem I had with this cut is either the x-axis binded somewhere or somehow otherwise the 0 point changed so that the inner and outer cuts weren't aligned correctly. But at least it was a good test to make sure that my number fits within the CNC here, since I am basically cutting at the maximum size that I can with this particular machine. For my second attempt, I did go ahead and attach that brush, and you'll also notice I added 2 more screws at the center of my stock to make sure that this plywood is really held down. As the CNC lowers to make its cut, you can see how all those bristles kind of push outward. It kind of looks like a sea creature scuttling across the ocean floor or something. And it actually works really well. So you'll notice here that there are no longer any traces of sawdust being left behind. It's an incredibly clean cut. So I'm really happy with how this brush worked out. This cut looked a lot nicer, but I did still make a mistake of not adjusting the cutting depth in Fusion 360. So it's cutting much deeper here than it actually had to, and because of that, the tabs that I programmed in were too low, and they didn't actually hold the piece in place. But luckily I was able to just hold down the piece until it finished, and I still got that clean cut that I was hoping for. So that's one piece down, and now I'll just go ahead and bring in my next 2x3 foot piece of plywood and screw that into place, just as I did with the last one. And I'll go ahead and run my next operation for the second layer of this number, which should have been fine, but this time around I failed to notice this cable right here, which managed to wrap itself around the Z-axis, and somehow it didn't rip itself apart, but it did keep the X-axis from following the path that it was supposed to, and it did this messed up cut. But luckily I caught it just in time to stop the operation, fix that, and then run it again. And somehow that messed up cut just barely stayed within the part that I was getting rid of. So I was still able to use this piece of wood. Very lucky there. Great, so at this point I was finally getting a hang of things, and I was able to run one operation after the next, just doing the different layers of this number. Now, when it came to the final back piece, that 3/4 inch piece of plywood, I was a bit worried about what would happen to the brush, but luckily it was just high up enough that it did manage to complete the cut, and it didn't ruin the brush too much. Some of those bristles did get trimmed down a little bit by the end mill, but the cut came out super clean, and it's still vacuuming up all the sawdust, which is fantastic. Okay, so now I've cut out all of these layers, and the next step is to remove the tabs and clean them up. Online, there's several different ways to remove these tabs, from using chisels to using a router, but I really like this technique of just doing a quick and swift strike with a hammer against a utility knife, which does a good job of cutting the tabs off on these delicate 1/4 inch pieces of plywood. After a bit of practice, I got pretty good at it, and I was able to get most of those tabs in one hit. Most of them. I went ahead and did that with all of the pieces, and you can see I got this pretty gross back edge for this final 3/4 inch piece, but it actually cleaned up pretty quickly by just doing a quick bit of sanding with a flat sanding block. As far as getting rid of those little nubs that are left from the tabs, I found that a large rasp like this works quite well. I just clamped the piece down to the table, that way I could use 2 hands and take care of these. And I really liked doing this as opposed to using a hand router or some kind of power tool, because it gives me that control that I need to get a nice flush trim. And it really wasn't that hard. Although there are a lot of pieces in this project, so every step, of course, did end up taking quite a bit of time, just because I have to do the same thing for every single layer. Anyways, here are all the layers stacked together, and after I had those tabs mostly removed, I went ahead and clamped everything together. That way I could sand it all at once and create these nice flush edges. Then I went ahead and took them apart again to do a little bit of extra sanding and just clean it up as much as I could before I start priming and painting. Now for the priming, my first attempt was to use this really old oil-based primer. After mixing it up for probably half an hour, I tried rolling it onto one of the numbers, and it worked all right, but this oil-based primer does take quite a bit of time to dry, and when it came to rolling the paint onto these really skinny sections, it got kind of difficult, and I was a bit worried about snapping this very fragile plywood. So my solution there was to instead hang up all of these numbers and take care of the priming using a spray primer. Here I'm using a 2-in-1 filler primer, and this is often used for auto work, and it's pretty much my favorite way to prime parts because it helps you get a nice even coat, it sands really well, and it also dries rather quickly. So I went ahead, primed all the parts, sanded them down, and then there were some areas that still needed a bit of wood fill, so I filled all the holes that I could find, and then of course I went over that again with a bit more primer, a bit more sanding, until I was finally ready to apply the paint coat. This is a flat finish Sherwin-Williams Infinity paint, which is basically the best stuff that I could get at Lowe's. And while this latex paint did react a bit with the oil-based primer that I used on this particular piece, I was able to get a nice flat finish after 3 or so coats. With those thinner pieces, I did try painting them while they were hanging up, but that didn't really prove to be helpful at all. So I ended up putting those on the table as well, with little pieces of plywood underneath to hold them up from the table. That way I could paint both the top surfaces and those little side edges that are going to be visible. For the most part, I used a dense foam roller to paint the top surfaces, and then I went back in with a small paintbrush to handle the edges here, which would have been really hard to do with a roller. Once again, it was definitely an act of patience to paint all of these different layers and make sure there's no spots that I missed, but overall everything worked out quite nice, and I was left with really flat, clean finishes for each of these pieces. So after a quick test to make sure everything still lined up, which it did, it was time to actually fix all of these layers together. So my strategy here was to first align all the pieces just using double stick tape to create a semi-temporary connection just to hold everything in place. After sanding down any lumps of paint on the back, I went ahead and just applied that tape here and there, and then I just carefully aligned everything by hand, stuck this piece down, then went ahead and did the same for the following piece, and the layer after that as well. Now, before adding my final layer, I thought I'd combine these 4 pieces using a pneumatic nail gun. So after I calibrated that and made sure that my aim was pretty good, I went all the way around the border with these 1¼ inch nails, which will make sure that these pieces really stick together. Although unfortunately in some areas, the power of that air gun was too much and it cracked some of the wood. So I had to go back in and fill some of these larger cracks with this thick cyanoacrylate by Starbond. I went ahead and just filled that with super glue and then clamped it shut, which did a pretty good job of hiding that seam. For other areas where it just raised the back a bit, I just sanded it down. And then there were yet other areas where I had to go in with some wood fill. And finally, I touched all of those little imperfections up with another coat or 2 of this paint. I also decided to use this same thick super glue to attach the top layer. So I just did a really thin line of glue all the way around the border and then very carefully placed my final layer. Without using the accelerant, this super glue does still take a few minutes to completely harden, so I held everything down with whatever heavy objects I had around me, and after that was all dry, I went ahead and removed everything. And of course that left a few new scuffs, so I went ahead and did a few final touch-ups with the paintbrush. After leaving that in front of the fan to dry for a couple hours, it was time to do the final polyurethane coat. I made sure to dust the piece off as well as I could, and then I applied this Minwax spray-on polyurethane coat. I'm gonna do 3 rather thick coats of this stuff, and when it's all dried up, you won't really notice this coat. But as you saw by how easily the paint got scuffed or scratched, this final coat is really gonna be critical in maintaining this piece and making sure that it's a lot more robust for public display. So here we are with the completed number 3. It's finally done. It was a lot of work, but I'm so happy with how it turned out. As with all of these numbers, there were little issues that I had to deal with along the way. It's very hard to keep big projects like this looking pristine, especially when you have a lot of sticky coats of paint and lacquer and things like that. But I'm really proud with the end result, and I hope you enjoyed watching the process and maybe learned some things along the way as well. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to reading all your comments, especially with these woodworking projects that I'm pretty new at. I get a lot of really helpful advice in the comments. And if you just want to say thanks for making this video, give me a thumbs up. That's greatly appreciated as well. Look forward to more awesome numbers and other cool projects here on Make Anything, but that's it for today. So until next time, I'm Devin, this is Make Anything, and as always, stay inspired.